The Trump administration's dismantling of its Agency for Global Media is driving heated debate over access to accurate information and freedom of expression. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective for April 2nd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now, last month, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees a number of federal broadcasters, including the Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. For more on this order and its broader repercussions, I have Cheon Soram with Radio Free Asia here in the studio. Soram, thank you for returning this week.
Glad to be here.
I also have independent journalist Jessica Stone over in the U.S. joining our session virtually today. Jessica, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Right, now, Jessica, I previously had the pleasure of your company when you were working for the Voice of America, which I understand is no longer the case.
That's true.
Right, then, Jessica, before we delve into details, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with the work of the Voice of America, let's start with some background information about it.
Well, we have Voice of America has 360 million viewers weekly around the world, and those are unduplicated viewers. So a tremendous amount of people around the world view the content of Voice of America, and it's in more than 40 languages. So people are getting that information in their native tongues. It comes in TV, radio, social media, digital. And according to pollsters, 86% of worldwide audiences tell pollsters that they trust the content. One of the distinguishing factors with VOA content, of course, is that it's going to inform people about things that are going on in their own countries that sometimes their own governments and their own media do not talk about. So take, for example, what happened in Tiananmen Square in Beijing with those student protests and the military crackdown, the COVID outbreak in Wuhan. These were stories that the Chinese media did not cover, but the U.S. media and VOA did cover and got it into those countries. North Koreans about Gulag. So it's really about showing what it looks like to have a free press. That's the goal.
Right. Jessica, do correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been said that Mr. Trump has been targeting the VOA since his first term in office. Do tell us why that has been the case, and what does his second administration gain from VOA's absence?
Well, Mr. Trump has been tough on VOA, as he has been on all journalists, but particularly VOA because it's a taxpayer-funded organization. And so by law, even though it's congressionally appropriated funds, the president seems to feel that he has an impact on whether or not VOA should be continued to be funded. So he has complained throughout his tenure back in 2020. He complained about narratives coming out of VOA he felt were more aligned with Chinese propaganda. That was the accusation. Now the accusations come in the form of an executive order that put on administrative leave all of the VOA's 1,300 employees and terminated its contractors. This time, the executive orders say things like that reporters post anti-Trump content on social media, that they are cautious about calling Hamas terrorists without attribution, that their coverage is too pro-Biden. All of these things in context can be explained as journalistic approach to the content that VOA covers. But essentially, Trump wants to deny taxpayer funding to a news outlet that can criticize him. And this is an outlet that has editorial independence, that has been given that by law so that it can criticize the president. And the premise for that, and any other U.S. policy or U.S. politician, I should add, the premise for that is that a credible media for the rest of the world needs to be able to do those things, because that's what a free press looks like.
Right. Soram, I believe Radio Free Asia also faces the same dismal fate. First, do tell us a bit about the work of Radio Free Asia, and what do you believe would be the broader ripple effects of its absence?
So RFA has been a key source of independent journalism since it was founded in 1996. Funded by the U.S. Congress, RFA delivers uncensored news to the audience in countries where freedom of the press is not restricted. Freedom of press is restricted. Places like North Korea, China, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Tibet, and Uyghur region, and Vietnam. So our mission is simple: to deliver uncensored, reliable, and accurate news and information to the people who doesn't really have access to the information. But now RFA is facing a crisis. RFA may be forced to shut down entirely by the end of April due to funding issues. If that happens, the consequences will be far-reaching. Many of our reporters have already been followed. This means we are struggling to cover North Korea as we used to, leaving people inside of the country with fewer ways to getting outside information. RFA Korean service has reporters who are from North Korea, defector reporters. They have played a crucial role in delivering inside information, how human rights abuses continue under the regime, how the market system is evolving, and more. As we all know, North Korea's inside information is extremely limited. But because of these defector reporters, we were able to bridge that gap. So without these reporters, we might lose one of the few windows into what's happening on the ground. Many defectors have said that exposure to outside information was a key factor in their decision to escape. That's why the North Korea regime is so sensitive about external information, and that's why the regime tries so hard to block the outside information. So I believe that RFA has a meaningful impact when it comes to bringing outside information into the North Korea. So we send news directly into the country, and if we lose this platform, millions of people could be left in dark, and the regime's control over information will only get stronger.
Right, and against this backdrop of concern, Soram, I understand pro-Chinese pundits have been applauding Mr. Trump's crackdown on such media, that is the RFA and the VOA. What have they been saying?
So pro-China people are welcoming the Trump leadership's action on RFA and VOA, and it's not hard to see why. RFA and VOA have long been a source of independent reporting on issues the Chinese government would rather keep secret. Topics like human rights abuses, censorship, government crackdowns on dissent, and more. So by shutting down RFA and VOA, the U.S. is essentially doing something the government, Chinese government, has long been desired, removing independent sources of information that challenges its official narrative. With RFA closing, the Chinese government now has one less challenge to control its the information. Chinese state media and pro-China commentators have been quick to highlight this development. The Global Times described it as a self-implicated wound for the U.S. and mocking Washington's commitment to freedom of the press. Hu Xijin, a well-known nationalist commentator, called the closure gratifying and suggested that the U.S. is no longer able to sustain its global influence. Others have framed it as a sign of American decline, arguing that the country is turning inward and stepping away from its role as a media powerhouse. So this reaction highlights a bigger issue. When governments suppress independent journalism, authoritarian regimes are the ones that benefit. The loss of RFA and VOA weakens the flow of reliable information, not just in China, but also in North Korea and more.
Right. Jessica, there is also talk about American public media outlets, such as the NPR and PBS, of course, being the next targets of the Trump administration. What have you been hearing there in Washington?
Well, certainly Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a very conservative firebrand in the MAGA mold, has been supportive of that, as have some other far-right Republicans. But the New York Times media reporter actually obtained their playbook for what happens if, in fact, they are denied federal funding. And it pretty much guts the operation on the local level. It turns out that it would not harm the national headquarters of these operations as much as it would the local affiliates, and there are about 1,000 of them for NPR alone around the country. They get most of their funding from the federal government. And that's a critical source of local news for those communities. You know, just like around the world in the United States, we are seeing a real shift in the media landscape, a lot less local news. And those local reporters would pretty much bear the brunt of any funding lapse. But the argument for the Republicans is that it would save $240 million and that it would be, part of what they see as an inherent bias against conservative and Republican ideals from the mainstream media, which is to say the main legacy outlets, and among those are PBS and NPR, but also the cable stations, the network stations, NBC, CBS, ABC, as well as MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, all having biases. Certainly Fox is not associated with a anti-Trump bias overtly, but this is the argument that has been going on really since I began in journalism more than 25 years ago, that the mainstream media has an anti-Republican or anti-right-leaning bias.
Jessica, some claim that Mr. Trump is blatantly attacking the freedom of the press. I mean, AP, it's not allowed in the White House given its refusal to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. Keeping all this in mind, Jessica, how does this look to affect his, or serve his interests, if you will?
Well, again, I think that read on it is part of the narrative that the mainstream media is perpetuating, that this is about freedom of the press, as opposed to what the Trump administration and many on the right see as a sort of trying to even the playing field ideologically between coverage on the right and the left. And remember, all main U.S. media printed portions of the Russian dossier, which accused President Trump at the time during his first term of Russia collusion. And there was not as much due diligence on the origins of that Russia dossier as we now know, which was that it was a CIA-generated DNC propagated document that led to the impeachment of the sitting president at the time. Just today, for example, or I should say yesterday, 2 independent journalists that are now previously in the mainstream media, now having gone fully independent, uncovered evidence that FBI agents did squash the Hunter Biden laptop story just ahead of the 2020 election. President Trump is pretty clear on this. He wants more favorable coverage. He does not like tough coverage. But what's happening more broadly in the media is there is an ongoing discussion in the public discourse in this country, and perhaps others as well, about who owns the narrative. And traditionally, we've had these legacy stations own the narrative. What you're seeing now is more and more independent journalists creating space for more discussion, more varied opinions, and that's why the Trump administration argues they have this new media seat in the White House briefing room. But certainly it is coming at a cost of these mainstream outlets. And the problem I just want to stress about what's going on with the Associated Press is that the Associated Press is a wire service that the world depends on. It's not just a AP, an American outlet. So when it has denied of access, and I know personally many of those journalists myself, they take their job seriously. They are part of a system that has been in place pre-Trump and has worked for many presidents on both the right and the left. But the White House is now trying to take control of that system, which is really not enshrined in law. It's really enshrined in tradition. And so that's part of the challenge that journalists are running into, is that they're questioning and legally challenging something that has been tradition and not as enshrined in law.
Right. For sure, something to think about, though.
And I mean that just about the relationship at the White House specifically, not the freedom of the press more broadly. That is enshrined in law.
Right, for sure, for sure. So, in regimes like North Korea, news, it's, like you mentioned earlier, it's strictly regulated to celebrate successes, if you will, and conceal failures, and of course condemn its enemies, notably South Korea. Do you fear some democratic countries then may be following in these footsteps? And if that is the case, what can be done perhaps to prevent this democratic backsliding?
This is a really hard question.
It is.
So in authoritarian regimes like North Korea, the media is used as a tool for the state. Sadly, we are starting to see similar trends in some democratic countries, raising concerns about democratic backsliding. However, democratic countries have many safeguards in place to counter these trends. One of the key protections is freedom of the press and freedom of expression. In authoritarian regimes, freedom of the press is severely restricted. And there are few major media outlets, and social media is also tightly controlled. For example, in China, they cannot use social media, outside social media, in their nation. And there are also some countries that doesn't have internet access to all people. So this kind of things make it easier for the government to censor information and manage the narrative. However, in democratic countries, some media might be influenced by the government or by the leadership at current leadership, but there are still independent outlets offering balance. Media diversity means there is not just one narrative. When the government messes up, the media will call it out. And when it highlights its success, experts and fact-checkers provide a reality check. So social media is another important buffer. In democratic countries, people have the power to challenge any media control. A good example could be South Korea's recent martial law situation. I like to focus on martial law itself, excluding the various political interpretation of its intent and outcomes. But martial law allows the state to restrict freedoms of the press, publication, assembly, and protest when it's necessary. However, lawmakers during the martial law quickly took to social media to make statements or broadcast live situation. And people also shared photos and videos of the situation on social media. And because they shared live updates through social media, I believe many people were able to understand what was happening on the ground, and which contributed to the martial law being lifted quickly. So do I fear that democratic countries maybe follow in the footsteps of authoritarian regimes when it comes to media control? Yes, I do, but only a little bit. However, in democratic nations, there are still many checks in place, such as independent media and social media, to prevent this from happening.
Right. Beyond the media, Jessica, the Trump administration has also reportedly threatened universities about substantial cuts to federal funding if they do not abide by his agenda on dismantling diversity, equity and inclusion programs and banning what he calls illegal protests on college campuses. That being said, are we looking at a renewed risk against freedom of speech, do you think?
Well, the freedom of the speech debate on college campuses predates Trump, and certainly has been, as someone who's been in the media for 25 years, I've seen a real shift in the younger generations and their understanding of what freedom of speech in the United States under the Constitution means. We increasingly see people interpret it as, that we don't criticize, that we don't have civil disobedience, and that we don't, that we sanction speech. So hate speech is actually protected under the U.S. Constitution. That doesn't mean it should lead to violence, but the actual words as a means of expression are protected under the U.S. Constitution. And so there has been a shift, I think, on college campuses where increasingly people from the right do not feel that they can express themselves. They're chased off. Their speakers are not allowed to come to campus. Their protests are not sanctioned. And yet we saw under Joe Biden, these anti-Semitic protests literally take over, pro-Hamas student protests, take over buildings, prevent students from going to class, shut down universities, and these universities receive federal funding. What I'm talking about in particular is Columbia University, which is one of the main targets of this discussion with respect to the Trump administration. They're denying $400 million in federal funding to Columbia because of what it allowed in those student protests and the impact it had on Jewish and Israeli-American students. But more broadly, there is this pushback on higher education from this administration. As you're probably well aware, they are trying to eliminate the Department of Education. That is a pass-through for a lot of funds to these higher educations. But they're also trying to eliminate parts of the Health and Human Services Department, which you also talked about at the top of your broadcast. So what's happening on college campuses is they are being impacted by their dependence on the federal government for funding, whether it's because of the argument that the Trump administration is making about anti-Semitism on these campuses. They have had an executive order on the canceling of DEI programs. That's affecting funding. But also on the healthcare front, they are canceling research contracts to these universities. Johns Hopkins University, a very prominent research university, says it has to lay off 2,200 people because of the research grants that have been ended by the United States government. We're also seeing Harvard being threatened. $9 billion in federal funding to Harvard now under threat because of alleged anti-Semitism there. So it's more than just about free speech, but it is part of an ongoing dialogue that's going on in this country about what these main elite universities and institutions represent. Do they represent the people and all perspectives, or do they represent a left-leaning perspective that is carried on by the mainstream media and the mainstream outlets that are, and the argument is, should they be taxpayer funded if they're not representing everybody?
Jessica, one very quick question. You mentioned the dismantling of the health ministry as well as the education ministry. That being said, is there a common denominator among the federal agencies selected by Mr. Trump for downsizing?
I think it's hard to find one ideologically, except for the clear ideological rationale that big government is not for the people, that large programs, that an administrative state, that a lot of bureaucracy is not in favor of the U.S. people. And I think what that calls into question is what the role of government is and whether or not government can serve the people. Certainly, there are main constitutionally enshrined functions of the government: national security, protecting water and air. But there is a real dismantling of the cost of government under this administration. And we are seeing the first victims of this, certainly not hard power, right? USAID, education, healthcare. We are seeing, but it hasn't happened yet, that the Pentagon is asking for 60,000 civilian jobs to be cut. The Secretary of Defense is asking for recommendations within 2 weeks for cuts to get to $580 million. But this is the hugest department spending in the U.S. government, other than entitlement spending, is happening at the Pentagon, and we're seeing. The question is, how does this affect U.S. readiness for conflict? How does it affect U.S. readiness for pandemics, the likes of which we've, of course, recently seen? And with respect to the Pentagon and how this affects U.S. readiness in the information space, but also in the military space, are they trying to just focus on a potential China contingency as opposed to anything in Europe or Africa or South America? Well, the reality is, the adversaries of the United States, and particularly the Chinese government, is funding its own media and many other parts of soft power around the world. If the U.S. retreats from those areas, that leaves a void, and that void will be filled by other voices, primarily from authoritarian countries who have better capitalized, better systems for that information spreading.
Right, a very concerning thing to think about. Jessica, so many questions, so few answers, I have to say. That's all the time we have, Jessica, but as always, thank you very much for your insights today.
Good to be with you.
Right, and Soram, as always, thank you very much for returning this week.
Thanks for having me.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this Wednesday. Do join us again same time tomorrow for a look at U.S. reciprocal tariffs.